Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of American history, where isolation breeds secrets and secrets breed horrors that echo through generations. I'm your narrator, and this is a chronicle of the forgotten, the buried, and the deliberately obscured. Before we descend into the fog-covered mountains of West Virginia, I want to know where you are right now. Tell me in the comments below, where are you watching from? And what time is it in your part of the world? Are you alone in the darkness or surrounded by the comfort of daylight? This matters because what we're about to explore together will change how you see isolation, family, and the fragile line between civilization and savagery. The year is 1908. Theodore Roosevelt occupies the White House. The Wright brothers have barely proven that human flight is possible, and most of America is connected by rail and telegraph. But deep in the Appalachian Mountains of McDowell County, West Virginia, there exists a place where time moves differently, a place called Hollow Creek, a community of approximately 60 souls, living as their grandparents had lived, as their great-grandparents had lived, cut off from the world not by choice alone, but by design. On October 14, 1908, a woman stumbled into the police station in Welch, West Virginia. Her name was Sarah Brennan. She was 28 years old, though she looked a decade older. Her clothes were torn, her feet were bleeding, and her eyes held the kind of terror that cannot be fabricated. She had walked 17 miles through dense forest, crossing 2 rivers and climbing ridges that would challenge experienced hunters. When Sheriff Marcus Donnelly asked her what she was running from, she spoke 3 words that would launch one of the most disturbing investigations in West Virginia history. They're all family. What Sarah Brennan revealed in her initial testimony seemed impossible. She described a community where brothers married sisters, where uncles took nieces as wives, where the family tree had become a tangled vine choking itself. She spoke of children born with deformities hidden in root cellars, of a patriarch named Elias Brennan who claimed divine authority over every marriage, every birth, every death. She described rituals conducted in a church where the crosses hung upside down and medical experiments performed in the name of preserving bloodline purity. The authorities were skeptical. Hollow Creek was known to them, but only as a rumor, a ghost story told by loggers and hunters who claimed to have glimpsed it through the mountain fog. No official census had ever been conducted there. No mail was delivered. No taxes were paid. It existed in a legal gray zone, a community that had simply fallen through the cracks of bureaucracy and geography. State investigator Thomas Garrett was assigned to the case. At 42 years old, Garrett had seen his share of Appalachian darkness, coal mine disasters, labor violence, moonshine, wars, but nothing had prepared him for what he would discover when he finally reached Hollow Creek on October 29, 1908. In his official report, filed with the West Virginia State Police on November 8, he wrote, "What I found in Hollow Creek challenges every assumption I held about human nature and the limits of moral degradation. This is not a community. This is a laboratory of human suffering, conducted across 3 generations. But here's what makes this case truly haunting. By the time Garrett's report was filed, Sarah Brennan had vanished. No trace of her was ever found. The community of Hollow Creek was evacuated, but 14 bodies discovered in unmarked graves were never identified. Elias Brennan died in custody before trial, taking his secrets to an unmarked grave of his own. And in the decades that followed, strange discoveries continued to surface, fragments of a truth so disturbing that even now, more than a century later, we're still piecing together what really happened in those fog-shrouded mountains. This is the cold case of Hollow Creek. This is the story that West Virginia tried to forget. To understand Hollow Creek, we must first understand the landscape that birthed it. McDowell County, West Virginia, in the early 1900s was a place of contradictions. The coal boom was transforming the region, bringing railroads, company towns, and an influx of immigrants from Italy, Poland, and Eastern Europe. But this modernization only touched the valleys. The mountains remained as they had always been, impenetrable, hostile to outsiders, and home to communities that had been there since before the Civil War. The Brennan family arrived in what would become Hollow Creek in 1847, according to a partially preserved land deed discovered in the Welch County Courthouse in 1952. The patriarch of that original family was Josiah Brennan, a Presbyterian minister who had been expelled from his congregation in Virginia for what church records diplomatically describe as theological irregularities and moral transgressions. Josiah brought with him his wife, Margaret, their 5 children, and 3 other families, the Cowles, the Pratts, and the Ashbys, 16 people in total, seeking refuge in a place where questions wouldn't follow them. The location they chose was brutal in its isolation. Hollow Creek sat in a natural depression surrounded by 3 steep ridges, accessible only through a single narrow pass that became impassable during winter months. The nearest settlement was 17 miles away through trackless forest. A small creek provided water, but the soil was poor and the growing season was short. In a letter discovered in the West Virginia Historical Society archives, dated 1851, a traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Blackwood wrote, "I ventured to the Brennan settlement and found them living in conditions of extreme privation. They have built a church, crude but serviceable, but I observed no school, no proper cemetery, and an unsettling atmosphere of secrecy. When I offered to perform marriages and baptisms, Josiah Brennan informed me that he alone served as spiritual authority for his flock. I did not stay the night." By the time of the Civil War, Hollow Creek had grown to approximately 30 residents. West Virginia's formation as a separate state in 1863 barely registered in the community. They were too remote for either Union or Confederate forces to bother with. This isolation intensified after the war. While the rest of McDowell County slowly connected to the outside world through timber companies and coal operations, Hollow Creek remained frozen in time. A second-hand account from an 1879 edition of the Welch Daily News mentions a peculiar settlement in the high country where the residents refuse all contact with outsiders and are rumored to practice the old ways, whatever that might mean. The old ways began to take on sinister meaning with Elias Brennan, grandson of the original, Josiah. Born in 1841, Elias grew up in a community where the gene pool had already begun to show signs of dangerous constriction. With only 4 founding families and limited outside contact, marriages between cousins had become common. But Elias, who assumed leadership of Hollow Creek after his father's death in 1868, transformed necessity into ideology. In a journal fragment recovered from the ruins of the Hollow Creek Church in 1954, believed to be in Elias's handwriting, we find this chilling passage. "The corruption of the outside world seeps in through new blood. Our strength lies in our purity, our separation from the mongrel masses. God has shown me that the family which keeps to itself achieves a kind of divine crystallization, a refinement of the soul made manifest in the flesh. Those who object to the sacred unions I have decreed are servants of the corrupting forces." By 1890, Hollow Creek had entered what historians now refer to as the closed period. No one left, no one entered. The few attempts by government officials to conduct census operations were met with armed resistance. A deputy sheriff, who tried to serve legal papers in 1896, reported being chased off by men carrying rifles, and his account mentions seeing children with faces I cannot properly describe, hidden quickly from view when we approached. The community developed its own internal structure under Elias's rule. He positioned himself as both patriarch and prophet, claiming direct communication with God regarding every major decision. Marriages required his approval, and according to Sarah Brennan's testimony, he personally arranged every union based on what he called bloodline optimization. Men worked the poor soil and hunted the increasingly depleted forests. Women existed in a state of perpetual pregnancy or child-rearing, many dying in childbirth due to lack of medical care. Children were taught to read using only the Bible and Elias's own writings, which apparently consisted of bizarre theological treatises mixing Presbyterian doctrine with notions of racial and familial purity that prefigured the eugenics movement. A crucial document in understanding the community is the Hollow Creek Register, a ledger book discovered in 1908 during the initial investigation. This register, kept by Elias personally, recorded births, deaths, and marriages from 1868 to 1908. What makes it disturbing is not just what it records, but what it reveals about the mathematical certainty of genetic disaster. By the third generation, family trees showed siblings marrying siblings, fathers taking daughters as second wives after their mothers died, uncles marrying multiple nieces. The register uses clinical language, but between the lines one can calculate the inevitable, a population collapsing under the weight of its own genetic load. By 1908, Hollow Creek was not a functioning community, but a slow-motion catastrophe. The population had peaked at around 65 individuals in the mid-1890s, but had declined to approximately 57 by the time of Sarah Brennan's escape. Infant mortality was catastrophic. Of the 23 births recorded in the register between 1900 and 1908, 14 children died before age 5, and of the 9 who survived, medical examinations conducted after the evacuation revealed various physical and cognitive impairments consistent with severe inbreeding. This was the world Sarah Brennan was born into in 1880. The world she lived in for 28 years. The world she finally found the courage to flee on foot through 17 miles of mountain wilderness to tell the truth that Hollow Creek had been hiding for 3 generations. But the question that haunted Thomas Garrett from the moment he set foot in that fog-shrouded valley was not just what had happened in Hollow Creek, but why. Why had no one intervened sooner? Why had the authorities turned a blind eye? And most disturbingly, how many other hollow creeks existed in the vast, unmapped mountains of Appalachia? Thomas Garrett's journey to Hollow Creek began on October 22, 1908, 8 days after Sarah Brennan's arrival in Welch. He brought with him Deputy Sheriff Marcus Donnelly, a court stenographer named William Price, and Dr. Edmund Hutchins, the county medical examiner. The party also included 2 local guides who claimed to know the way, though both admitted they had never actually entered the settlement itself, only glimpsed it from the ridgeline above. The journey took 3 days. Garrett's field notes, preserved in the West Virginia State Archives, describe increasingly unsettling observations as they approached. On the first day, they encountered abandoned hunting camps with strange markings carved into trees, symbols that none of the guides could identify. On the second day, they found the remains of what appeared to be a checkpoint, a crude gate across the trail, long since fallen into disrepair, with a weathered sign that read, "Private land, trespassers will be shot." On the morning of October 25th, they reached the ridge overlooking Hollow Creek. What Garrett saw contradicted Sarah Brennan's testimony in one crucial way. The settlement was not hidden or concealed. It sat in plain view in the valley below, a collection of perhaps 20 structures surrounding a white church with a tall steeple. Smoke rose from several chimneys. Chickens moved in yards. It looked from a distance almost normal, but as they descended into the valley, the illusion crumbled. The first house they approached seemed inhabited. Clothes hung on a line. A rocking chair moved slowly on the porch. But when they called out, no one answered. The door stood ajar. Inside, Garrett found a table set for a meal that had never been eaten. Food remained on plates, now covered in mold. A child's doll sat in a chair, its painted face staring at the doorway. They moved through the settlement, calling out, finding each structure similarly abandoned. Some houses showed signs of hasty departure, clothes scattered, doors left open, personal items discarded. Others appeared carefully secured, as if the inhabitants had left with the intention of returning. But the most disturbing discovery came in the third house they searched. In what appeared to be a root cellar, Dr. Hutchins found a cage. It was roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, built of heavy timber with a barred door. Inside the cage were blankets, a chamber pot, and scratch marks. On the walls, deep scratch marks made over what must have been months or years. When Price, the stenographer, asked what it was for, Dr. Hutchins simply closed the cellar door and said, "We need to search the church." The Hollow Creek Church stood at the center of the settlement, larger than necessary for a community of 60 people. Its white paint was peeling, its steeple tilted slightly to the east, but it was structurally sound. The front doors were locked. Garrett ordered them forced open. The interior was a violation of everything a church should be. The pews had been rearranged into concentric circles rather than rows. The pulpit faced the back wall instead of the congregation, and on the wall behind where the pulpit should have been, someone had painted an enormous family tree, not with names but with numbers, hundreds of numbers, connected by lines showing marriages and births, going back 3 generations. Dr. Hutchins, examining the tree closely, realized what it represented: a breeding chart, like those used for livestock. Beneath the family tree, they found Elias Brennan's study. The door was locked, but the frame was weak. Inside, they discovered the true archive of Hollow Creek's descent. Journals, dozens of them, dating back to 1868, all in Elias's meticulous handwriting. Medical texts on heredity and eugenics. Photographs, dozens of photographs that Dr. Hutchins immediately ordered be collected as evidence but not examined until they were away from the settlement. And in a locked drawer of Elias's desk, they found what became known as the Book of Unions. This ledger detailed every marriage in Hollow Creek since Elias took control. Each entry included the names of the couple, their relationship to each other, their ages, and a clinical assessment of the children produced by the union. Entries marked favorable indicated children who survived and appeared healthy. Entries marked unfavorable were followed by locations. Disposed in the creek, buried in the high field, kept in the cellar until expiration. Deputy Donnelly found the cemetery behind the church, or rather he found 3 cemeteries. The first was well maintained, with carved headstones marking the graves of community elders and respected members. The second was cruder, wooden crosses marking smaller graves, many without names. The third was simply a cleared area in the forest, marked by a single stone that read, "The Unfortunates." Dr. Hutchins began counting. Mounds. He stopped at 43. As the sun began to set on their first day in Hollow Creek, the search party made another discovery that changed the nature of the investigation entirely. In a barn on the eastern edge of the settlement, they found a man. He was alive, though barely. His name, they would later learn, was Michael Pratt. He was 34 years old, though he looked twice that. He was chained to a support beam, surrounded by his own filth, and when he saw the strangers, he began to scream. Dr. Hutchins sedated him. When Michael Pratt woke the next morning, under guard in their camp outside the settlement, he told them a story that made Sarah Brennan's testimony seem understated. He described a community where dissent meant imprisonment or death, where Elias Brennan ruled with absolute authority, backed by a council of his sons and nephews, where children born with visible deformities were taken from their mothers and never seen again, where young girls were promised to much older relatives in marriages arranged before they reached puberty. Michael Pratt claimed he had been imprisoned for 3 months because he had protested when Elias arranged for Michael's 14-year-old daughter Ruth to marry Elias's 52-year-old son Jeremiah. When Michael refused to give his blessing, he was declared corrupted by outside thinking and locked in the barn as an example to others. But here's where the mystery deepens. When Garrett asked where everyone had gone, Michael Pratt's face changed. The fear that had animated his testimony vanished, replaced by something worse: confusion. "What do you mean, gone?" he asked. "They were here yesterday. They brought me food yesterday. They were all here." The search party had arrived on October 25th. Michael Pratt claimed he'd last seen the community on October 24th. In the space of a single night, approximately 57 people had vanished into the mountains without a trace. No tracks leading away. No signs of struggle. The houses had been abandoned so recently that food was still fresh on tables, fires still warm in stoves. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Was this a mass exodus? Did Elias order his followers to scatter into the mountains when he learned investigators were coming? Or did something else happen in Hollow Creek on the night of October 24, 1908? Something that Michael Pratt, locked in his barn prison, was not witness to. Garrett ordered a full search of the surrounding forest. What his men found over the next 3 days would transform this investigation from a case of social deviance into something far more disturbing, something that suggested the people of Hollow Creek hadn't just hidden their practices from the outside world, they had been hiding something from each other as well. The forest search began at dawn on October 26th. Garrett divided his expanded team, now including 6 additional deputies from Welch, into pairs, each tasked with searching a different sector radiating from the settlement. They were looking for any sign of the missing residents: tracks, campsites, belongings, bodies. What they found instead was a network of caves. The first cavern was discovered by deputies Frank Morrison and Charles Webb, approximately half a mile northeast of the settlement. The entrance was concealed behind a fallen tree and heavy brush, deliberately camouflaged. Morrison's report describes a narrow opening that widened into a larger chamber roughly 20 feet across. Inside, they found evidence of regular human occupation: oil lamps, wooden crates, and a strong smell of chemicals. Dr. Hutchins was summoned to examine the site. What he found in those crates would haunt him for the rest of his life. Medical instruments, scalpels, forceps, bone saws, all showing signs of heavy use. Bottles of chloroform and ether, both substances used for anesthesia. Jars containing what Dr. Hutchins initially believed to be preserved specimens, though he refused to specify their nature in his official report, noting only that they were of human origin and suggestive of experimental procedures. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of notebooks stacked in a wooden box. These were not Elias's theological journals, but medical logs, written in a different hand, smaller, more precise. The signature on each entry read, E.B. Physician. Elias Brennan had apparently styled himself a doctor, despite having no formal medical training beyond what he might have gleaned from the outdated texts they found in his study. The entries detailed procedures performed on what the notebooks called specimens. Each specimen was identified only by a number corresponding to the breeding chart they'd found in the church. The procedures ranged from simple examinations to interventions that Dr. Hutchins described in his private notes as medieval in their barbarism. One entry from March 1904 reads, "Specimen 47 delivered of infant with significant cranial malformation. Immediate termination performed, mother sedated and returned to community. Disposal in Eastern Cavern completed, no complications." They found the Eastern Cavern the next day. It was deeper, colder, and at the back, partially concealed by rocks, they found human remains. Dr. Hutchins counted 17 distinct individuals, most of them infants or small children. All showed signs of physical abnormalities, skeletal deformities, unusual skull shapes, evidence of developmental disorders. These were the unfortunates, the children who had been taken from their mothers and never returned. But the medical logs suggested something beyond mere disposal of deformed infants. There were entries describing attempts at what Elias called corrective breeding, selecting specific couples based on which combinations had previously produced the healthiest children, then preventing those who produced unhealthy offspring from having more children through methods the logs describe as permanent intervention. Dr. Hutchins's interpretation was chilling. Elias had been conducting a eugenic experiment on his own community, treating them as laboratory animals in a multi-generational study of heredity. The question that consumed Garrett as they catalogued these horrors was simple but terrible. Had the people of Hollow Creek known? Had they been complicit in Elias's experiments, or had they been victims themselves, trapped by isolation and fear? The answer would come from an unexpected source: the photographs. On the evening of October 27th, Dr. Hutchins finally felt prepared to examine the photographs they'd collected from Elias's study. He did so in private, then emerged pale and shaking, requesting that Garrett view them immediately. What those photographs revealed changed the nature of the investigation yet again. There were 137 photographs in total, dating from approximately 1885 to 1908. The earliest were formal family portraits, stiff and unremarkable by the standards of the era. But as the years progressed, the photographs became stranger. Group portraits showed the same faces appearing in multiple family units, children who resembled each other so strongly they could only be siblings posed as cousins or worse. The physical effects of inbreeding became increasingly visible: prognathism, unusual facial proportions, signs of developmental delays visible even in still images. But it was the later photographs, those from 1900 onward, that carried the most disturbing implications. These were not formal portraits, but documentary images. Children standing in lines, marked with numbers pinned to their clothes. Adults arranged by height and physical characteristic. Close-up images of hands, feet, eyes, documenting specific features. These were not family photographs. These were scientific records, the kind a researcher might keep when studying animal populations. One series of photographs, dated 1906, showed what appeared to be a wedding ceremony. The bride looked no older than 13. The groom was clearly in his 50s. They stood before Elias Brennan, who held a Bible aloft. But what made the image truly disturbing was visible in the background. The other members of the community, watching with expressions that Price, the stenographer, described as neither celebratory nor horrified, but resigned, as if witnessing something inevitable and terrible. Another set of photographs documented what could only be described as medical examinations. Individuals, mostly women and children, photographed in clinical poses, their clothing removed, their bodies marked with ink to highlight specific features. The detachment in these images was perhaps more disturbing than any overt violence would have been. They were the photographs of someone who saw his subjects not as people, but as data. But two photographs stood out from all the others, both taken in 1907. The first showed the interior of what appeared to be the cavern they'd discovered. In it, a young woman lay on a table, clearly sedated or unconscious. Elias Brennan stood beside her, holding what looked like surgical instruments. The woman was visibly pregnant. The photograph's reverse side bore a notation, Specimen 52, Intervention, Successful Extraction. The second photograph showed the same woman perhaps 6 months later, holding an infant, but her expression was one of such profound grief and confusion that even through the static medium of early photography, the emotion was palpable. On the reverse, Specimen 52, replacement infant provided from Specimen 47, subject unaware. The implication was staggering. Elias had not just been disposing of infants born with deformities, he had been replacing them with healthy infants from other mothers, maintaining the fiction that each woman's child had survived, when in reality a complex shell game of infant swapping had been occurring too. Maintained community morale while continuing the experiment. Dr. Hutchins made a calculation based on the breeding register and the medical logs. Of the 23 children born between 1900 and 1908, perhaps only 7 had been raised by their biological mothers. The rest had been swapped, disposed of, or in cases where no healthy replacement was available, the mothers had simply been told their infants had died of natural causes. He was playing God, Garrett wrote in his personal journal, but worse than that, he had convinced them he was God, and in their isolation, with no outside reference point, they believed him. But one question remained unanswered. Where were they now? If the people of Hollow Creek had fled, they would need food, shelter, organization. 57 people don't simply vanish into the wilderness and survive unless they had a plan, unless Elias had prepared for this possibility. The answer lay beneath the church, in a place none of them had thought to look. On October 28th, while conducting a final survey of the church, Deputy Morrison noticed something unusual about the floorboards near the pulpit. They sounded hollow when struck. Within an hour, they discovered a trap door concealed beneath a heavy rug that had been positioned to look like permanent flooring. The stairs descended 15 feet into darkness. What they found at the bottom redefined everything they thought they understood about Hollow Creek. The chamber was large, perhaps 30 feet across, carved from the mountain bedrock with considerable effort and skill. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were supplies, preserved food, water barrels, medical supplies, blankets, tools. Enough to sustain a large group for months, perhaps years. This was not a hastily prepared refuge. This was a bunker constructed over considerable time with careful planning. But the supplies were not what captured their attention. It was the walls themselves. Every surface not occupied by shelves was covered in writing. Elias's writing they recognized from his journals, but this was different. This was his magnum opus, his grand statement of purpose and belief. The text began with what Elias called the revelation of pure blood, dated 1895. It outlined his complete philosophy, a twisted amalgamation of biblical literalism, pseudo-scientific racism, and apocalyptic prophecy. He believed that the corruption of the modern world would lead to divine judgment, and that only those who had maintained absolute purity, bloodline purity, spiritual purity, isolation from contamination, would survive. Hollow Creek, in his vision, was not a failed community but a sanctuary, a new Eden where humanity would be reborn after the world outside destroyed itself. But as they read further, they discovered that Elias's vision had evolved. By 1900, he no longer believed that simply maintaining isolation was sufficient. He had become convinced that active intervention was necessary, that the bloodline needed to be refined through selective breeding and the removal of defective specimens. The medical experiments, the infant swapping, the arranged marriages, all of it was in service of creating what he called the perfected line. And then they found the dates. Throughout the text, Elias had made specific predictions about when the outside world would collapse, when divine judgment would come, when Hollow Creek would emerge as the seed of a new humanity. The most recent date, written in larger letters than the others, was October 24th, 1908, the date the community had vanished. According to Elias's writings, on this date, the faithful shall descend into the earth to await the cleansing fire. He had apparently convinced his followers that on October 24th the apocalypse would begin, and they needed to take refuge underground until it was safe to emerge. But where was this refuge? The chamber they stood in could not house 57 people. There had to be more deeper tunnels, perhaps entire complexes they hadn't yet discovered. The mountain was honeycombed with natural caves, and 3 generations of Brennans had plenty of time to explore, expand, and prepare. Garrett organized another search, this time focused on finding cave entrances large enough to admit groups of people. What they discovered over the next 2 days suggested something both tragic and terrifying. There were at least 7 major cave systems within 2 miles of Hollow Creek, all showing signs of human modification and use. But every cave they explored was empty. No people, no recent signs of habitation, nothing but old supplies and abandoned preparations. It was as if the community of Hollow Creek had descended into the earth and simply ceased to exist. On the morning of October 30th, Michael Pratt, who had recovered somewhat under Dr. Hutchins's care, made a statement that opened a new and darker possibility. Elias told us, he said, that when we entered the sanctuary we would be transformed, that we would shed our corrupted flesh and emerge as pure spirits in perfected bodies. He said there would be no pain, no suffering, only a moment of darkness followed by eternal light. The implication was inescapable. Dr. Hutchins spoke it aloud, though everyone had already reached the same conclusion. He led them into the caves to die, mass suicide, justified as spiritual transformation. But if that were true, where were the bodies? The official investigation of Hollow Creek concluded on November 8, 1908, with Thomas Garrett's final report to the West Virginia State Police. The conclusions were deliberately vague. A community engaged in unlawful practices had been discovered and evacuated. 17 bodies had been recovered from cave systems. The whereabouts of 57 missing individuals remained unknown. Elias Brennan died in custody on November 2, 1908, of what the coroner ruled a heart attack, though some whispered it was. Suicide by poison. Michael Pratt and Sarah Brennan were listed as the sole survivors, though as noted, Sarah disappeared before any trial could commence. The case was quietly closed. The land was seized by the state, and Hollow Creek was officially abandoned. By 1910, nature had begun to reclaim the settlement. By 1920, most people in McDowell County had forgotten it ever existed. But the story of Hollow Creek didn't end in 1908. It merely went dormant, waiting for new voices to resurrect it. From the archives, the first resurrection came in 1953. Dr. Robert Chen, a cultural anthropologist from the University of West Virginia, was researching isolated Appalachian communities for his doctoral dissertation when he stumbled across a reference to the Brennan case in a footnote of a 1912 sociology text. Intrigued, he traveled to Welch and requested access to the county records. What he found shocked him. Boxes of evidence that had never been properly catalogued, never studied, simply stored and forgotten. Among these materials, Dr. Chen discovered something that had been overlooked in the original investigation, a series of letters written by Elias Brennan between 1895 and 1907, apparently intended for someone outside the community but never sent. These letters, addressed to Brother Josiah, no relation to the original patriarch, suggested that Elias had been corresponding with someone who shared his beliefs, someone who was conducting similar experiments in another isolated community. The letters referenced our shared work, parallel developments, and most disturbingly, the eventual union of our perfected lines. Dr. Chen spent 3 years trying to identify Brother Josiah. He combed through records from Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina, looking for similar cases of isolated communities with unusual practices. He found rumors, whispers, second-hand accounts, but nothing concrete. In his 1956 dissertation, later published as The Hollow Creek Phenomenon, Isolation, Ideology, and Genetic Catastrophe, he concluded that Brother Josiah was likely a figment of Elias's deteriorating mental state, an imagined ally in his growing madness. But Dr. Chen did make one verifiable discovery that reignited interest in the case. In the basement of an abandoned house in Hollow Creek, one that had been overlooked in the original investigation, he found a diary belonging to a woman named Martha Cowell. The diary, dated from 1905 to 1908, provided the first insider perspective on life in the community during its final years. Martha's entries were heartbreaking in their mundane horror. She described the constant fear, the way families had learned to hide their grief when children disappeared, the whispered conversations about escape that never led to action because where would we go and who would believe us? She wrote about being forced to give up 2 of her own children, both born with what Elias deemed unfavorable characteristics, and being given instead a healthy infant that she knew was not hers, but loved anyway because a child needs a mother, even if she is not the mother who bore it. But the diary's final entry, dated October 23, 1908, was the most revealing. Tomorrow Elias says we descend to the sanctuary. He has shown the elders the signs in Scripture, the alignment of the stars, the dreams that came to him in the cavern. He says we will sleep for a time in the darkness, and when we wake, the world above will be cleansed and we will inherit it as the pure ones. Rebecca is afraid. I am afraid. But where else can we go? What else can we do? We have lived too long in darkness to believe in light anymore. Dr. Chen's work brought renewed attention to Hollow Creek. Local newspapers ran stories about West Virginia's forgotten horror. Amateur investigators began exploring the site, though by then little remained above ground. But the cave systems were still there, and in 1958, a group of spelunkers from Virginia Tech made a discovery that suggested the missing residents of Hollow Creek had not simply vanished. 3 miles from the original settlement, in a cave system that had not been explored during the 1908 investigation, they found human remains, many human remains. The cave entrance had collapsed, either naturally or deliberately, sealing the interior. When rescue teams cleared the entrance and entered the chamber beyond, they found what appeared to be the final resting place of Hollow Creek. The bodies, 43, could be identified, though the remains were commingled and difficult to separate, were arranged in a circular pattern around a central altar-like stone. On that stone were the remnants of what appeared to be ceremonial objects, a Bible, mostly destroyed by moisture and time, metal cups that might have contained liquid, and fragments of fabric that might have been ceremonial robes. The forensic analysis, primitive by modern standards, suggested the deaths had occurred within a narrow time window consistent with mass poisoning or asphyxiation. The 1958 report concluded that Elias Brennan had led his followers into the cave system on October 24, 1908, promised them transformation and salvation, and instead delivered death. Whether through poison or by sealing the cave entrance and allowing them to suffocate, he had carried out what amounted to a mass murder-suicide, the Jonestown of Appalachia, 70 years before Jim Jones. But even This discovery didn't close the case. 43 bodies had been found. The 1908 census estimated 57 people in the community. Where were the other 14? The answer came piecemeal over the following decades. In 1964, hikers found skeletal remains in a ravine 5 miles south of Hollow Creek. Forensic analysis suggested the individual had died from exposure, likely while trying to flee through the mountains. In 1971, construction workers building a new highway discovered a shallow grave containing 3 individuals, 2 adults and 1 child, showing signs of violence that suggested they had been killed, possibly by other community members who viewed their attempt to escape as betrayal. In 1976, a woman named Elizabeth Porter, aged 87, gave a deathbed confession to a Methodist minister in Bluefield, West Virginia. She claimed that in 1908, as a 19-year-old girl named Elizabeth Ashby, she had escaped from Hollow Creek 2 days before the mass death. She had, hidden in the forest, watching from a distance as Elias led the community into the caves. She saw them enter. She saw guards posted at the entrance. She saw, 3 days later, those same guards collapse the entrance with dynamite and then walk away into the forest, never to be seen again. Elizabeth had then walked to the nearest town, but by the time she arrived, the official investigation was already underway and the narrative already set. She was terrified that if she revealed herself as a survivor, she would be forced to return, or worse, that no one would believe her and she would be institutionalized. So she changed her name, moved away, married, had children, and carried the secret for 68 years. Her testimony was recorded, but never officially verified. She died 2 days after giving it. The final fragment came in 1982, when the West Virginia Historical Society received an anonymous package. Inside was a photograph professionally taken, dated 1925. It showed an elderly man sitting on a porch somewhere warm. Palm trees were visible in the background. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, Elias Brennan, San Diego, California, age 84. If the photograph was genuine, it meant that Elias Brennan had not died in custody in 1908. It meant someone else had been buried in his place, and the architect of Hollow Creek's horror had escaped, lived another 17 years in freedom, and died of natural causes far from the mountains that had witnessed his crimes. The photograph has never been authenticated. Official records show Elias Brennan died November 2, 1908, in the McDowell County Jail. But the possibility, however remote, that he escaped justice haunts every researcher who studies the Hollow Creek case. Because if Elias survived, if he established himself elsewhere, if he found new followers in a new location, then Hollow Creek might not have been an isolated incident, but a prototype, a test case for horrors replicated elsewhere and never discovered. To this day, researchers occasionally find new fragments, a letter in an estate sale, a photograph in an antique store, a diary in an attic. Each piece adds to the puzzle, but the complete picture remains elusive, obscured by time, deliberate destruction of evidence, and the simple fact that some horrors are so profound that even those who witness them struggle to articulate what they saw. More than a century has passed since Thomas Garrett first descended into the fog-shrouded valley of Hollow Creek. The settlement itself has been completely reclaimed by nature. Trees grow through the foundations of houses. The church steeple collapsed in the 1970s. The caves have been sealed multiple times by authorities concerned about the safety of curious explorers. But the questions remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What really happened on the night of October 24, 1908? The official explanation is mass suicide, a community so thoroughly indoctrinated that they followed their leader into death, believing they would awaken transformed. It's a tidy explanation, one that fits the evidence. The bodies in the cave, the preparations, the apocalyptic writings, the testimony of survivors. Elias Brennan was a madman with a messiah complex. His followers were victims of isolation and psychological manipulation, and when his prophecy failed to materialize, he chose death over facing the consequences of his crimes. But this explanation leaves troubling gaps. Why were only 43 bodies found when 57 people entered the caves? The 14 missing cannot all be accounted for by the scattered remains discovered over subsequent decades. And if Elias died in custody in 1908, who were the guards Elizabeth Porter claimed to have seen collapsing the cave entrance? Who took that photograph in San Diego in 1925? A second theory, favored by some researchers, suggests fragmentation. Perhaps not everyone believed Elias's promises. Perhaps there was conflict in those final days, violence between true believers and those who wanted to escape or surrender to authorities. Perhaps some did escape, scattering into the Appalachian wilderness, changing their names, disappearing into the vast, anonymous population of early 20th century America. Perhaps descendants of Hollow Creek walk among us today, carrying genes and secrets from that isolated valley, unaware of their dark heritage. But there is a third theory, one that serious historians dismiss, but that refuses to die in the folklore of McDowell County. This theory suggests that Hollow Creek was never truly abandoned, that the cave systems beneath those mountains go deeper than anyone has explored, that some of the community did exactly what Elias promised, descended into the earth and waited, not for death, but for the world above to forget them. And in that forgetting, in that absence of scrutiny, they have continued, generation after generation, following the same practices, maintaining the same isolation, waiting for the day when they believe it will be safe to emerge. There is no evidence for this theory. But then again, there was no evidence for Hollow Creek until Sarah Brennan stumbled into that police station in 1908. How many other communities might exist in the vast, unmapped wilderness of the American mountains? How many other prophets might be conducting experiments in isolation, hidden from oversight, breeding their own twisted visions of purity? Though lessons of Hollow Creek are clear, even if the complete truth never will be. Isolation breeds extremism, unchecked authority becomes tyranny, and the human capacity for self-deception, for following charismatic leaders into darkness, is deeper and more dangerous than we want to believe. Sarah Brennan was never found. Michael Pratt died in 1934, having never fully recovered from his ordeal and never speaking publicly about Hollow Creek after his initial testimony. The last person with direct memory of the community died in 1991. Now, all we have are documents, photographs, bones, and theories. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened in Hollow Creek. The files remain in the West Virginia State Archives, available to researchers but rarely requested. The cave systems are sealed but not destroyed. And in the autumn, when fog settles into the mountain valleys, some locals still avoid certain areas, still speak in whispers about the place where families forgot what it meant to be human. This has been the story of Hollow Creek, West Virginia, a chronicle of isolation, ideology, and the terrible things that humans will do when they believe they are building paradise. Before we part ways, I want to hear from you. What do you think really happened on October 24th, 1908? Do you believe Elias died in custody, or did he escape? Could there be other communities like Hollow Creek, still hidden in the mountains, still following the same dark practices? Share your theories in the comments below. This is not just my investigation, it's ours. We are a community of truth seekers, drawn together by the mysteries that history tried to bury. If this story affected you, if it made you question what might be hidden in the isolated corners of our world, then please subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. There are more forgotten horrors waiting to be discovered, more cold cases that demand our attention, more truths buried in archives and caves, and the collective silence of communities that chose forgetting over facing the darkness of their past. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows. Until we meet again in the next episode, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, the most terrifying monsters are not those in folklore, but those that wear human faces and claim divine authority. Welcome to our haunted community. We'll see you in the darkness.